Good evening, Sigma Chi brothers and all others who are listening in tonight. We are so pleased that you have joined us for our June and final SIG Talk for the 2023-24 season. I'm Jim Cooper, Vice President of the New York City Alumni Chapter and Chair for the SIG Talk program. SIG Talks are a collaboration of the New York City and Washington, D.C. alumni chapters. Joining me from the DC chapter this evening is my co-host, Bruce Kastner. The speaker for tonight's talk is a highly accomplished business executive, Bob Lord. I'm not going to detail Bob's career biography, as that will emerge in his talk. Traditional job titles do not fit Bob's experience and expertise. He will tell you that he is a technologist, but what he truly relishes is his role as a transformational leader at the intersection of technology, marketing, and media, the blend of which are critical factors in today's global economy and have an ever-expanding importance in our future. One thing I know for certain, during the next 45 minutes in listening to Bob, we are all going to add to our understanding of how business is increasingly impacted by the digital world. Oh, and of course, Bob is a Sigma Chi, an alumnus of our Psi chapter. So please join me in welcoming Bob Lord to SIG Talks. Good evening, Bob.
Hey, Jim. Thanks for having me on.
Very, very pleased to have you, Bob. Now, I'm going to start with the questions and a little bit about your background. Bob, you grew up in northern New Jersey. How did those early years in the suburb of New York City shape the person that you became?
Yeah, I look back at the time that I was in Jersey, and New York was just across the Hudson River. And I think the ambitions and the scale of the promise of what New York could bring to somebody. Growing up my dad was a lifelong telephone man and climbed poles. He came from the Depression. We operated on a budget every week, and my mom and dad counted the dollars, and we sort of made men's meet. And I started working very early in my life, probably when I was 12 or 13. So the work ethic was built into me, but the ambition was always there as you sort of looked across the Hudson River or went into New York City every once in a while to go see the Christmas lights or whatever it may be. And that ambition was always there for me. When I left high school, I was probably only 1% of my high school that went to college. Most of the folks that I went to school with went into their dad's trades or went and worked, or became, housewives or housemakers. That was really where the career path was. So I was an exception within the town I grew up in. But the ambitions were there. My parents stoked work ethic in us from the beginning.
So that blue collar background is something that really helped build in some strong fundamentals for you. Now, you enrolled in the well-known Syracuse University and matriculated as an industrial engineering and operations research major. The first two jobs you had following graduation were in manufacturing operations at the Academy companies of General Motors and Corning, Inc. Although industrial engineering would encompass only 5 years of your early career, what value did you derive from those two experiences?
Yeah, so, Syracuse University was a world that I didn't know and I didn't understand when I joined Syracuse. The only reason why I applied to Syracuse was one of my dad's supervisor's son had gone to Syracuse University. My father knew about it, and he told me I should apply to this school. It was in upstate New York. I was a little reluctant about going to the school, but my first year as a freshman, it opened my eyes up to a world that I had never been exposed to before. The diversity, the number of programs that were there, the options I had. And quite honestly, Jim, I went in as a pre-med major into Syracuse, but realized very quickly at freshman year that I actually enjoyed the math and science work more than I actually did the biology and the human sciences. So I switched my major over into engineering, and thank goodness I did. Because at that time at Syracuse University, they had something called a cooperative engineering program, and they allowed me to interview with General Motors. And the summer of my sophomore year, I went to go work as an intern at General Motors in Buffalo, New York, as a shift supervisor on the factory floor. And it was just another eye-opening experience about what business was about and how things got made. You know, we were making air conditioner and radiator cores and assembly engines for General Motors cars. It was a fascinating ride for me. And I ended up doing that my junior year also. And really understanding, quite honestly, what engineering was about and what my job would be once I got out of graduation. And I honestly, you know, one of the most important things you can do is decide while you're going through college. Your internships are so important to you because it either says you like something or you don't like something. So when you graduate school, you sort of have an idea of what kind of career path you want to go on. And I knew I wanted to be an industrial engineer in operations research. I loved the job. It was working with factory workers. It was helping to install robotic machines into factories. And I quickly had to make a decision between General Motors and Corning Glassworks and decided to go to Corning Glassworks. And that put me in a corporate engineering role, which was like a consulting position. And at that point, Corning was just thinking about fiber optics. It was a brand new business line for them. And I got exposed to sort of that new research and engineering there and worked at Corning Glassworks for about 5 years. Probably not the best place I'd suggest to you as a single male. You know, it's a very small town in upstate New York, but made lifelong friends there. And quite honestly, probably a really good chance for me to really understand what it meant to run a business, what it meant around process control, quality control. You know, people were envious of what the Japanese had done. We flew over to Japan to look at what Toyota was doing with their quality control engineering and brought it to Corning. So there's a lot of innovations that they exposed me to as a young engineer that I wouldn't have gotten anywhere else. And then, obviously, as you know, they sponsored me to go to business school 5 years later.
Well, that comment you made about internships is certainly one that I hope our undergraduates are paying attention to. And of course, while you were at Syracuse, you joined Sigma Chi. We'll come back to that a little later in the talk.
Well, that was a new experience too for me. So yeah, we'll talk about that later.
And it certainly sounds like, you know, your experience at Corning was a great foundation for your career that was coming a little later. You decided following 4+ years at Corning to go back to academia and earn a master's of business administration. You gained admission to the Harvard MBA program. Tell us a bit about what it's like to be a Harvard MBA student, and how would you describe the competitiveness of the environment?
Yeah, so, you know, what was so interesting as an engineer, there weren't many engineers at that time, you know, in 1989, that were actually going into business schools. You know, you would go back for your master's in technology at Carnegie Mellon. You'd go back to MIT for data science. And I really chose a path that was not aligned with what would normally happen in an engineering ranks. And I applied to the Harvard Business School. And my angle to the Harvard Business School was very much that I wanted to really make a pivot. And what I saw, Jim, when I worked with plant managers was I wanted to run a business. I didn't want to be just an engineer. I just didn't want to be a scientist. I didn't want to be a researcher. I wanted to run a business. It was so exciting for me to see a plant manager, you know, run a Corningware factory and own the profitability of that factory from revenue all the way through the costs. It was a fascination to me to really just understand what that meant at scale. So my argument to HBS, which I guess worked, was to say I really needed a pivot in my career, and I wanted to bring my engineering skills and the rigor, the thinking I had, how I thought about problems to the world of business. Now that sounds pretty trite right now, but back then, in my class at Harvard, there was only 5% of the 900 students that were engineers. So that was both a challenge but it was also an advantage when you came into the class, because you were an odd duck when you sat in class, because my perspective was very different than everyone else who was sitting in the class. And as you know, Harvard Business School and the Darden School, there are certain schools that are dedicated to the case learning method, the Socratic method of teaching,
Right.
which is you read a case and then you go in and you discuss that case with a professor and your other 89 peers that are in your class. And it's a very different way of learning, because you have to absorb the learning, and then at the end of the semester you have an exam. So the challenge most of the time is everyone doesn't get to talk in a 90-minute class. So your challenge is when you actually said something, you need to make sure it resonated in the class and that it stuck with the professor, because your grades were about participation as well as your final exam. So you became very, very quickly learned that you needed to be very succinct in how you actually spoke. You needed to be a problem solver. You needed to follow up with people, and you needed to team with people to actually reinforce one another's points to make a coherent argument in class. And a lot of times that didn't happen well. The professor would come in and say, Bob, I'd like you to open up the case today, which means basically you're the first one to talk, and you have to summarize the case for the entire class and take a point of view. And most of the time, and most of the people who did very well took a very arbitrary point of view just to make a point, and then everyone would argue against that point. But it's important in those kind of situations to actually look at a situation and a problem in many, many different ways. So it was competitive, but the biggest takeaway I would say that I got out of Harvard Business School was my ability to communicate succinctly, was to not just automatically go with your gut to solve the problem, but to understand multiple viewpoints before you came to a conclusion, which was really the whole process of the case study method, and then ultimately make a decision and go with it. And if the decision wasn't a good decision, move it along.
Right.
I recently, this last semester, I went back to Harvard and I taught as an executive fellow. So I was teaching some case studies, which I will tell you, it's a lot harder to teach the case studies than it is actually to participate in them. But it was a really rewarding time for me to go back to business school and actually teach some of these case studies in a class called Scaling Technology Ventures with a professor, Jeffrey Rayport.
Thanks for that explanation, because, we've all heard of Harvard Business School, but, never gotten the kind of insights that you've just given to us about what it's like to be there. And, it sounds like, the way the case study method operates is it puts a certain amount of pressure on the student in a positive way that, is certainly present when you're in business as well. So
it helps when you go into a board meeting and you have a hostile board meeting you have to deal with around the company and give them bad news. So it kind of helps prep you for that.
Harken back to how you handled the pressure at business school when you're there. So following Harvard, you went the route of business consulting with Symmetrics. You were a project manager there and worked with several companies addressing their issues and strategies. What were the greatest challenges in consulting work, and how did that add to the development of your knowledge and skills? Also, when you did leave, what prompted you to leave? But let's start with, what that experience was like.
Yeah, this would be another example, Jim, of where I took the road less traveled. As I did say, Corning sponsored me to go back to business school.
Yep.
And I had the choice to go back and work at Corning for another 5 years or pay them my tuition back. I chose to pay the tuition back. And the reason why I did that was they wanted me to go back into the same engineering department that I had left only 2 years earlier. Yes, as a senior manager, but it was the same job, just slightly different. And I had grown so much at Harvard Business School that I just couldn't step backwards. I wasn't going to be learning. And we should come back to that later about sort of making sure that you don't waste your career and you don't waste the efforts that you have as a young engineer or a young employee anywhere.
Okay.
So I took a consulting job. Number one, economically, it made a lot of sense because I could pay back my bills to Corning, which I paid all those bills back. And it gave me exposure for the first time to a company that was actually taking technology and transforming businesses. Symmetrics was in the re-engineering business, which it was called at the time. But what it really was looking at processes and figuring out, with the archaic technology we had back then, how could we use technology to change the processes and make work life easier for human beings? Today it's almost second nature that we use phones, but no phones were around then. Our cell phones were not around. And it took a lot of compute power to get information in the hands of, let's say, a claims administrator or someone who was selling a car. So it was my exposure to really know, to figure out how we apply technology to business problems. And back then there were business plans, and the technology strategy was buried at the bottom of the business plan. It wasn't core to the business strategy at all. Nowadays, if you don't have technology at the forefront of your business plan, it's not going to be picked up by anybody. So the world has changed dramatically. So it was a very first time we were actually talking about, desktop servers, like computing power that would fit under people's desks. What do you do with that? And Symmetrics exposed me to a lot of that. And the reason why I left was, I go back to my analogy of my plant manager wanting to be a plant manager. As a consultant, you can only do so much. You're not running anything, right? You're basically just helping clients and advising clients to do things. And it's a project by project based assignment. And I wanted a profit and loss business to run.
Right.
So I was working for a client at the time called NovaCare, and they offered me to run a $20 million business in North and South Carolina. And we had just had a small baby, and we picked up our life in Boston and went, and I ran a $20 million P&L. Now, I will tell you, number one, from a lifestyle standpoint, that was a tough thing to do. But also, it was probably the hardest job I had, because I owned everything around North Carolina and South Carolina for that business.
Mm-hmm.
The revenue, I owned the recruiting, I owned the firing, I owned the cost management, I owned all the client relationships. There was nothing that was stopping. And all I had to do was to contribute the bottom line back to the corporate organization. That, I will tell you, had seeded me to run the $12 billion business that I ran at IBM over the last 8 years. That experience in the P&L was probably the pivotal moment that changed my life. And when I give career advice now to anyone who wants to actually be in business long-term, whether you want to be a VC investor, whether you want to be a private equity investor, you have to understand operations. Because there's no way that you can actually do any kind of investing if you don't know the management team, you don't know how it runs. And a lot of the advisory work I do now is all about how an operation needs to run, and instinctively now. But that all came from that one pivot that I made, leaving Symmetrics, that consulting firm, and going to work for a company called NovaCare, and running that North and South Carolina business. It was only $20 million, but it made an impression on me.
Oh, yeah. Well, it sounds like it was baptism by fire.
Yeah.
And, from what you'd said earlier, it also sounds like that leadership management, piece was in your DNA, and here you got a chance to really start exercising it. And, it's kind of interesting to hear how certain things become that pivotal point in a career, which you might not, looking at a whole resume, point to, but I completely understand what you're talking about in terms of the high impact it had on you and your future. So I'm going to now turn it over to Bruce to continue the questioning and continue following your career track.
Okay. Hey, Bruce.
Thank you, Jim. And Bob, it's great to have you with us. You've got some really great wisdom transfer going on. So we're real pleased for that. I know our audiences as well. Bob, we're limited in our time tonight for SigTalks. So let's fast forward to 2003 when you joined Razorfish. You held a variety of senior executive positions there for more than 10 years. Tell us a little bit about the company's mission and business, and what were the highlights of your time with them?
Yeah, so Razorfish was an interesting business that I had moved back to Boston and had worked for a competitor of NovaCare. And they were a consulting firm that was actually helping people put up websites. If you can imagine the time in 1999, most people didn't have any websites. The World Wide Web was brand new. And Razorfish was charging probably $900 an hour to pop up a faux website for people because no one knew what it was or how it worked. But, you know, marketers realized they had to at least have some kind of online presence. Forget about trying to do commerce online, just to skin it. So again, I had a business, Bruce, where it was at the intersection of technology and marketing. And this was, I would say to you, an understanding to me that the work I was doing for a Delta Airlines, for a Ford Motor Company, for a Pfizer, for a Genentech, for a ComScore, for 3Com, which is not around anymore. Some companies aren't even around anymore. For Boeing Airlines, we were basically helping them transform themselves into sort of leading with digital. And at that point, I started to understand that my job was about helping people transform themselves. And Razorfish became a company around transformation. And I actually co-authored a book, which was probably one of the highlights I did in my career. It's called Converge, Transforming Business at the Intersection of Marketing and Technology. I co-authored it with my CTO, Ray Velez. And that spawned up a whole bunch of work and challenges that we had in the industry. Now, the interesting thing, it was just at that moment, probably around 2005 maybe, where cloud computing, AWS, Amazon Web Services had just started. And the cost of compute came dramatically down. So again, the business of Razorfish had to transform itself to actually get into the commerce space. And we were sold over my career there probably 5 times. Once eventually to Microsoft, and then the last sale was to Publicis, which was an ad agency based out of France. And the great thing about it is Razorfish was at the lead of all of these kinds of transformations, and the names we had and the transformations that we did were pretty fantastic. We helped Hulu launch. We helped Chanel get online to sell cosmetics. I mean, things that had never been done before. We tried to create Facebook before Facebook was created for Conde Nast travelers. So it was a phenomenal sort of run to go up. But the reality was the technology wasn't there yet. So the promise was there, but the technology wasn't there in the marketing and media space. But eventually, we sort of became the transformation engine within Publicis Group. And as global CEO of Razorfish, I actually got more responsibility at Publicis, worked for that French agency for about 4 or 5 years, and then went over to AOL to help with their transformation to sell to Verizon.
Well, actually, you've given us an opportunity now to talk about your book.
Okay.
It discusses how technology, media, and creativity are uniting and how all this shift is revolutionizing marketing and business strategy. Can you elaborate a little bit on this idea and how it's evolved in the years since the book was published?
Yeah, the ironic thing is I said I co-authored it with my chief technology, Ray Velez, and I was only talking to him about 2 months ago. And if you actually look at the principles of the book around innovation, around eliminating silos, around organizational structure, our thesis around agile methodology and getting work done fast and failing forward, I'm telling you, the principles are right. They continue to be right, and they're not fully embraced by organizations, especially on the enterprise side. So the cases are old that we actually use to sort of highlight how those things work, but the core principles around organizational development and how to get work done are very, very familiar and are still relevant for the work that I even do today.
When you left Razorfish in 2013, it was a move to the famous, or some of us might say infamous, AOL.
Yeah.
In 2015, you became president of the company and grew revenues from twice over, from 1.5 to 3.0 billion through mergers and acquisitions. We, of course, all know that AOL was from the early days of the explosive growth of email. When you joined AOL, what was the primary business, and what was your strategy in the mergers and acquisitions that you led? And also, you oversaw the sale of AOL to Verizon for 4.4 billion. Nice profit there.
Yeah.
In June of 2015. Tell us, in addition to everything else that I've just been asking you, what was your decision? What led to the decision to sell the company?
Yeah, so when I came in, I was not there for a very long time, and I came in specifically to help Tim Armstrong, who was the CEO at the time, build a media business, an automated media business called programmatic media. So the acquisitions we did was all about creating this platform to automate media buying. So it's hard probably for a lot of people here on the phone to remember this, but when you used to do media buying, buy TV or buy digital ads, you used to do it through fax machines. You used to fax over something called insertion orders, and people used to have to sign off manually. We automated that, and what we did was we bought probably about 8 companies in a 2-year period and stitched them together to create something called AOL One. AOL One became that programmatic platform that we launched to the world. We were the first in this kind. There were many that followed us after. But the ironic thing was, when you build a platform like that, you need what's called an alpha client. And I chose Verizon as an alpha client. And Verizon was so intrigued by what we were doing and where we were going with the media business that they ended up acquiring us in June of 2015. And that really then focused AOL to buy Yahoo later on, and actually to grow its media business very differently than it did today. That was a fantastic acquisition. I stayed with the company probably about a year or so. Big company to be part of, and decided that wasn't something I wanted to continue to do. In my mind, Bruce, my learning stopped. I didn't say it that way then, but I wasn't learning anything new. I had gotten a call from IBM, from Ginny Rometty, and she offered me the job to come over as a chief digital officer to help continue to transform IBM. So I took that offer and went over there.
Great story. Okay, Jim, you're up.
All right. Thanks, Bruce. And picking up on your point, Bob, about moving over to IBM, the renowned IBM, from some things I read, you saw your mission as delivering the idea of cognitive computing when you came over to IBM. That is artificial intelligence, machine learning, and natural language processing to the masses. When asked about your goals, you indicated, as a transformational junkie, I just want people to know that my fingerprint is on making the pivot for IBM to be known as the premier cloud and computing company. So, Bob, with that lengthy preamble, please give us a layman's explanation of what you meant by that. And now, 7 years later, how did that all work out?
Yeah. So, the interesting thing about this is I was lucky enough to have, the sale of AOL to Verizon. And when you're sort of at that moment in your career, what do you want to do next? I was a little choosy because I wanted to get in a role where I could actually help a company transform itself. And quite honestly, the luster of IBM, as lots of folks remember it, had sort of tarnished. Right? It was the rise of a lot of the cloud computing companies, whether it was Amazon Web Services, Google, Microsoft had Azure at the time. There was technology that was being launched, and IBM was really not part of that mix. Accenture had grown their consulting organization almost as big or bigger what IBM was. And IBM had operated at an integrated model. Ginny Rometty came up through the sales ranks, and they needed to really, really transform itself. If you scratched under the surface of what IBM was doing, it was keeping the world running. It was working with governments all over the world, keeping their security systems going. It was working in our banking industry. It was the backbone of how commerce got done in the US and globally, and we weren't necessarily getting credit for it. And the reason for that was our tool sets had aged over time. And we weren't getting to the developers. The developers and the data scientists really were making decisions around technology. No longer was the chief information officer. So think about it, Jim. If I could just spin up an Amazon cloud instance with a credit card and start working, I could do that as a developer, and I'm very happy and I can get my work done. If I had to go through IBM, at the time, I had to get a contract signed. I had to get a PO done. Then, by the time I got the allocation of the software, I then had to load the software. They were just behind. So my job was to help them transform and actually move the business that way. And it was I have to say, my first year and a half was extremely challenging at IBM because the scale and the size of what IBM was and how it behaved, any idea was a great idea. But if you didn't figure out how to scale that idea and get it into the engine and scale it, you failed. So Ginny, rightly gave me about a $12 billion business to run when it came in the door. It was their digital sales business. I mean, the biggest business I had ever run up until that point was obviously, maybe it was AOL, was 3 billion. I mean, this was an enormous size of business in 158 countries. And you just couldn't think that because I have a good idea, Bob, it's going to get implemented. You had to not only get the good idea, but then you had to figure out how to get it into the system where it's repeatable over and over again. And one of the things that I launched was a program called Call for Code, which was to call the 24 million developers in the world to use IBM technology for free to solve global issues like climate change or healthcare issues. And we ran a contest. And I'm proud to say that program is still running. But it took us about 2 years and $10 million to get the thing running and to get it into the system of IBM. But that was to get developers used to the IBM tools and the tool sets. So I look back on my time there and I would say I was part of the transformation of what IBM is today. Ginny Rometty left halfway through my journey. A gentleman that I worked in the software group, his name is Arvind Krishna, product-based individual, probably the smartest man I've ever worked with. Really took the company to another level and bought a company called Red Hat, which transformed the company from the inside out. And has put the company on a trajectory specifically in this age of AI and large language models. The interesting thing for me, Jim, though, is, IBM, we have a really phenomenal research lab. And probably about 5 years ago, we were talking about quantum computing and large language models and, how you actually use generative AI and what that means, right? But until ChatGPT came out and sort of gave people the access to it, the accessibility of it, it wasn't really taking off at all.
Right.
So, but now IBM is benefiting from that because what IBM is doing is they're actually going back to all their enterprise clients. There anyone in the Fortune 500, you name any global company, IBM is in there doing its work. And we're upgrading our software and we're giving them access to large language models and data models that is actually helping them transform their business. And that's what Arvind and the team are doing now. So I recently left there, as you know, in January, and I'm now doing board and advisory work going forward. But it was probably at the end of my career, probably one of the smartest or best opportunities that I sort of landed in, because again, my learning started all over again.
Yep.
I opened my mind up. I learned about large language models. I learned about anomaly detection again. It got me back to my roots in technology. And surprisingly, I know a little bit about quantum computing now, which I would have never known if I hadn't gone there.
And I know you want to touch on some things for our younger generation in the audience a little later about the value of continuously challenging yourself and learning. But it really sounds like at IBM you had to figure out how to navigate your way through their system and even push back on some bureaucracy that was still there. But I really get the impression you helped them with their evolution to continue to be successful today. Just one other thing to touch on about IBM. You were involved with the Weather Channel business. And a lot of us didn't even know that IBM had anything to do with that. Could you talk a little bit about what they owned there and what your involvement was?
Yeah, prior to me coming, Ginny and the M&A team, in order to diversify and kind of go after this space that everyone was building applications, whether it was Salesforce in the CRM space or Dynamics that Microsoft was going after, IBM bought a lot of companies. And the weather company was one of the companies they bought because there was something called the Internet of Things. And they wanted the technology to actually bring an IBM offer to market around the Internet of Things. And they bought the weather company. all of those things didn't integrate the way that they should have integrated over time. And so when Ginny did leave and Arvind, got his strategy straight about what he was going to do with IBM, which I just described, there were assets that needed to be disposed of. So my job, actually, in the last 2 years I was there, was really to help to rationalize the portfolio for IBM. And I sold many assets to private equity, Centerbridge. And the last asset I ran, which was the weather company, needed an update. It needed to reset. And based on my media background with AOL, I was able to really recraft the weather company application. I hired a new CEO and we brought a new team in, and we really revamped that business. And my last, action there was actually to sell the weather company to Francisco Partners. And they now have a place to go. But the interesting thing, the weather data, which I really didn't understand, in all of the marketing work I've ever done. Again, this is another learning that I learned just recently, right? Was weather has so much impact on consumer behavior that 80 degrees in Austin and your behavior when it's 80 degrees in Austin, Texas is different when it's 80 degrees in Boston, Massachusetts, right? Your consumer behavior is very different. So if you're an advertiser, you want to target that individual very differently than what you did. And Weather Insights allowed us to do that. So we started an insight business, then we actually started a subscription model. So it was a really great sort of business to oversee and run, just because I was able to apply all of my different skill sets and turn that business around, which has been fun.
Absolutely. And talk about, again, another challenge where you had to learn something completely new to you. And late in your career. Before I turn it back over to Bruce, I was remiss in not telling the audience that if you have any questions for Bob that we haven't asked him about already and are going to continue to ask, you can enter those under the comment section, and we can come to those later on.
Yeah. Hey, I do see a comment here, which I will just say. I did sell Lotus Notes also to a company called HCL, which is public information. So Daniel F. is asking that question. Yes, but at a certain point, we did actually get rid of Lotus Notes as an application.
Bruce, let me toss it back over to you, and we'll leave IBM and go into some other things for Bob.
Exactly. Thanks much, Jim. Bob, in the areas of your expertise that you've been describing so well this evening, it seems inevitable if many roads, if not all of them, are going to lead to the further application of artificial intelligence. What would you say to our current undergraduates and young Sigma Chi alumni who are early in their careers regarding how AI will shape the future of business and what they can do to prepare for success in what is a rapidly evolving environment?
Yeah, Bruce, in my career and everything I have seen, and the promise of the internet and all this work that I've done to talk about the merger of sort of technology and media and marketing, AI, large language models, is going to change everything that we do. And I see this as a really, really positive change. Even today, we use Excel in a very laborious way. We try to get insight out of data wherever in any business that we are in. And what large language models allow you to do, or small language models people are starting to talk about, is to take a data set and glean insight out of it. And it is just a phenomenal way for us to become smarter as human beings, and actually use our brains in a different way than actually structuring data tables or writing data queries into, cloud computing platforms. So it is going to help us as human beings get better. There's always a downside. If you think about sort of even just the web today, there's the web we all use, and then there's the dark web. And it exists. It sells people's IDs underneath it. It sells things that are illegal on the dark web. And we coexist together. There's always good and bad. So you can go down the path and say artificial intelligence is a bad thing and it's not going to be very good for us. And there's doomsday talk about it. But I can tell you what I have realized and what I have seen, it's going to make us smarter as human beings, but it's going to change everything that we know and how we behave. So it's interesting. You start to see now, if you're a Microsoft user of PowerPoint, of their Office suite, excuse me.
All right.
You actually start to see the integration of something called Copilot, which allows them to give you suggestions about how you should actually put your PowerPoint together, or how you should actually enter in your calendar appointments. It starts to be an assistant for you. And that's what large language models can do, because large language models basically predict the answer for you based on past behavior. It's not always right, because people say, these AI models hallucinate. Well, they do, because they don't know the answer. That's why a human being is there. So you have to be careful. And people seem to always highlight, the bad hallucinations versus all the good it's doing. There's something I use all the time now. It's called Perplexity AI. And I would challenge the group to just use Perplexity AI for a week and do not do a Google search. And you will start to realize the power of what large language models can do for you. Now, there's a couple of barriers to get through to actually really get wide scale adoption of this. Is number one, trust. Can we actually trust these models, and will we trust these models? And my thought here is, just like we didn't trust automated driving or maps, Google Maps, when it first came out. I remember pulling out paper maps, even though Google Maps was telling me what to do. That'll come over time, because you'll start to trust your AI agent that you're using particularly. And actually, Perplexity AI actually tells you where it got the answer. So it starts to build that trust with you. And the other is cost. The reason why NVIDIA and all of these infrastructure stocks are going crazy right now is because there's a lot of compute power that it takes to run these large language models and this AI. And the cost of that needs to come down before it can get widely accepted, because it is too expensive for some business models. So those are two things I would suggest that we still have to work through. But as a young engineer, or a young data scientist, or a young business person just coming out of school, your life, you should start integrating AI and AI tools into how you get work done. And you will, because other people are going to do that, and they're going to be ahead of you. So just like, when I first went to business school, we had no computers. There'd be no way that you could compete by not Googling during your exams going on at HBS right now. You just need to incorporate the tools into the way that you do work right now.
Well, sticking with the theme of our younger brothers, what additional advice would you provide as important actions? I want to elaborate on that a little bit. What specific actions should they take to manage their careers successfully in light of this great sea change that you've just described with artificial intelligence?
Yeah. I get asked this question often. And I think we kind of have to step back just a little bit. And I actually see there's a question on here too about sort of Sigma Chi, did it influence my thinking about stuff? And the one thing that I honestly always remember is sort of a bit about the Jordan standard, about integrity, about a man of good character, fair ability. Those principles, you sort of, yes, you go through your ceremonies. You're not exactly sure what you're doing at the time when you're an undergraduate. But as you go through life, sometimes you need a touchstone. And I'm not saying I read the Jordan Standard much after I graduated school, but it did stick with me about sort of the principles that you had as a Sigma Chi. Because life is hard. The journey of life is not an easy thing. And I don't think that you have to be special, quote unquote special, or you have to be superior. You just have to be consistent, and you have to be disciplined. And you have to have a guiding light that you sort of bring with you through life. And that guiding light is not always looking in the rearview mirror and not always being negative on something. It's about looking forward. It's about being positive, and it's about bringing energy to a problem. And at a certain point in my life, I remember when we were interview people, my litmus test was very simple. Do I see them as a problem solver, or do I see them as people making excuses? If they were a problem solver, they could be part of my team. If they were making excuses, they weren't going to last very long, and they didn't last very long over time. And that's a very simple way of just thinking about that. But what does that mean? Like, what does that translate to as you become a leader? The first I will tell you is it's a lifetime learning journey. You cannot be the know-it-all within those rooms. And I've seen these guys and women come and go who come in and they think they know the answer. And IBM was full of them. They didn't last. Because you need to be a sponge. You need to absorb what the culture is. You need to assess what the problem is. Go back to my analogy about Harvard Business School. You need to look at all of the different angles of how to solve that problem or what the problem can be for you. So you need to absorb, you need to learn, and then you need to assess, and then you need to say, this is your point of view. People often believe that that is a sign of weakness. I actually see that as a sign of strength. Because what you're doing is you're understanding the situation you're in, you're leveraging your background, and then you're coming forward on it. And right now in my advisory and board roles, that is a skill set over and over that it allows me to have a home run. The second thing is you can't win every battle. You can't. So pick your punches. Like, this is not about, I have to win every time over and over again. It's like your golf game. It's like, I had a bad shot, forget about it and move forward. Like, pick your punches. Okay, you're not chipping well today, so do something else. Like, you just got to get through it. And I think that that's a really, really important thing of where you're going to battle, because it's exhausting if you try to pick a battle every day, every moment of time. And, two more. This is not a game of checkers. You have to play a game of chess. Meaning, what are you going to think about? Think about 3 moves ahead, not only for your professional career, but your life career with your family. Like, what does that mean? What are your parents going to be? Where are your kids going to be? Where are you going to be? What are you going to be satisfied with as you go through in life? What are you aiming to do? Thinking about it as a chess game is a lot better than just getting, a checker over the board and not knowing whether you're going to win or not. And that's pretty important. So if you take those 3 things and then you say, you know what, as an executive, I'm going to show up and I'm going to behave that way. That's the most important thing, because then you become a leader and you have people following you. And the way that you do that as a leader is you communicate. You communicate once, you communicate twice, you act and show and walk the talk that you have, right? There are numerous examples where brands have come out and promised things and they couldn't deliver. You have that same monkey on your back if you're out there communicating as a leader, and then you turn your back and you do exactly the opposite. And I've seen many, many executives do that, where they go out, talk to their employees, and then do exactly the opposite of what they said. You have got to show up. You've got to communicate. And all of that all adds up to the fact that you never, ever waste your career moment. If you're not learning anymore, you've got to leave. You got to move on, and you've got to get to the next challenge. Because challenging yourself makes you sharper mentally, I think, makes you a better executive, brings you energy, brings you positivity. And I would always say to my bosses, if I'm bored, I'm going to leave. So you need to give me more work, or you need to give me some challenging assignments. Now with IBM, they made me travel all around the world, so I'm not sure maybe that worked out as well as I wanted it to. But the fact of the matter is, you be open to new challenges all the time. And there are times when you have to say no. You have to say, no, I've got a family commitment, I have a trade-off. But the next time there's an opportunity, I really want you to consider me for this. So that I would leave you with, because I do think building yourself as a learning individual is probably one of the most important things you can do in your career.
Bob, I think you've just formed the basis of your next book. Really, really good stuff in what you've just given us. On your LinkedIn profile, nearly 50 plus people who know and have worked with you rate leadership as one of your most prominent capabilities. You made reference to that in our last exchange. Bob, in your view, what did you do as a leader to make yourself as effective as you have been in that role throughout your career?
It really does sound very trite and very simple. but there's a sense of living up to your commitments. If you promise somebody something or you make an agreement with somebody, you follow through on it. And if you can't follow through on it, you need to admit you couldn't follow through on it. That creates loyalty, that creates followership. And every once in a while, you have to be a bit self-deprecating because you can't win at everything all the time. So by being a little humble about who you are and what you can accomplish, and be very generous to the people around you that are making you successful. Because I'm not successful as a father, a man without my wife and my family. And I was not successful in my jobs because I was the executive. I was successful because of the teams I built around me and the teams that I inherited. And you have to be, if you want to lead a team, you need to bring that team along with you, and you need to reward that team, and you need to be generous. And, Bruce, it could be as simple as saying happy birthday to somebody. It could be simple as, letting somebody go 2 hours early because they have a commitment in the family to do. To be a real jerk, I would say, doesn't really build lawyership and fellowship. And I think being a leader is important. It's about high integrity. It's about possessing great morals. It's about being an upstander. Yeah, on a side note, one of the things that I did was I led the Black community group at IBM. After Ginny had left her post, Arvin came in and he asked me to help run the community. Now here I am, a white guy running the community from Connecticut, running the Black community. And the murder of George Floyd happens 2 weeks later. That was a situation I had never, ever been in before. And the only thing that I could do then was to listen. And I learned a heck of a lot. And I read a lot about the facets of racism that exist and what challenges we have, not only here in the country, but around the world. My point is, though, the people who made me successful was that team that supported me and was around me to get IBM through that challenge, and for us to actually launch the programs we launched to change the face of what the community had to face, over the next years that I ran that community. And it's probably one of the proudest moments I did. But again, I was put in a situation where I couldn't have done that myself. Now, people gave me the credit for it, but quite honestly, it wasn't me, Bruce. It was the community that surrounded me and embraced me to actually move that needle forward for us as a Black community within IBM. And then we influence outside of IBM with government and then ultimately the U.S. society. So I feel pretty good about that too.
Well, you've articulated very well a lot of the things that come out of the philosophical underpinnings of our fraternity. And you're going to have a chance to talk about that in a little bit. But one more question for me. You've recently retired from IBM, as you said. What led to your decision about departing from the company at this particular time in January?
It was a bit bittersweet for me. It was really more lifetime for me, lifestyle. We're out of COVID. I was turning 60. My kids had gotten back to New York. Everyone got back into their roles. We were empty nesters. My wife and I wanted to travel a bit more together. Now, we started to have the conversations a very long time ago, and you retire IBM, means a lot. And it takes a long time to get there. So those conversations were going for a while. I wanted to challenge myself again. I don't know what I'll do next. I'm doing a lot of advisory work and I've got some boards lined up, which I'm excited about. And like I said, I've been teaching a bit, but I don't know what's next. And I'm kind of excited about the pivot that I'm on right now. My original plan at IBM was really only to stay 3 years. I ended up staying 8. So it was a time for me in the journey. I had finished what Arvin, the CEO, had asked me to do. The weather company was the last asset to sell. So I felt like that part of my job had wrapped up. And I think it was just time for me to move on and do something different. And quite honestly, I am so thrilled to have my calendar back to myself that I couldn't be more happy. But I will be doing something more than just playing golf. That's for sure.
That's good to know. And the key to retirement is being able to do it while you're young enough to be able to enjoy it, I think. Is that
I
right?
think so. Actually, I think this retirement word's not a good word. I haven't figured out what the word is, but retirement doesn't sound right.
Turning the page. How about that?
Yeah, that's probably better. Start a new chapter.
Jim?
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Bob, I'm so glad we asked you those questions about what you would want to impart to our younger generation and your viewpoint on leadership, because the wisdom that poured out was just, very, very engaging and engrossing. And I'm glad to hear that you're not going to retire, because it really would be a shame for someone with your skills and leadership stature not to continue to implement that in various ways. You did already touch base a little bit on our final question, which is, how did your time as an undergraduate Sigma Chi experience connect for you in terms of your career and other aspects of your life as you move forward over, the next 40 to 45 years since your college days? You talked about the Jordan Standard. Are there any other comments you would have about what Sigma Chi has meant to you throughout your life?
Yeah, no, look, the one thing I didn't mention, which is probably really important, is the network. I talked a lot about how life is hard and you have to have consistency and discipline and rigor, but having a support network that you can rely on is, I think, probably one of the biggest benefits I've had of the Sigma Chi Psi chapter. And that could be as simple as just a phone call to say hello. There's no problem. How are you doing? Or it could be attending, a fraternity brother's wedding early on in my career, or now when I just text back and forth one another. It's just a really nice anchor to have as you're sort of navigating the choppy waters of life. And at one point, you sort of get to this point where are you gonna win the game of life, or are you gonna lose the game of life? My job was to figure out how to win the game of life for my family, and the network, at Sigma Chi was really, honestly, you could talk about high school sports and all that kind of stuff, but the network at Sigma Chi was really the first, as it's called, the fraternity. It was a network that was very tight. We experienced stuff together, that bonded us for life. I just remember it like it was yesterday. And then, you have work cohort groups that you kind of get to know better, but there's nothing like the experiences you went through with your fraternity brothers, good and bad, and some were bad, just as we all know, and some experiences were not as good as you'd like to sort of talk about. But those bad experiences and those good experiences sort of bond you in ways similar to what happened with me at HBS at Harvard Business School. You're in a room for a year and a half almost, with 90 other individuals, and you bond with them also. And that network gets sharper. So as you build, it's very important to keep that network alive. And I think it's just a really important thing as you sort of keep it in life. And I'm proud of seeing it with my kids. My two girls both went to Syracuse, and they were both Delta Gammas, and they have a sorority network that they're still using today. My son went to Cornell. He became a Sigma Phi, not Sigma Chi, Sigma Phi. And he has a very strong network from that fraternity also. And I do think that foundation and understanding what it means from a fraternity Greek system thing is something I think that's pretty special.
Well, it's so true. If you choose to take advantage of it, it's a tremendous support system, and a lot of us have experienced that as we've gone through life and gotten older. So I'm sorry to say that Bruce and I did such a good job of covering a lot of ground with you that we've run out of time, and we're not going to be able to entertain questions from the audience tonight. But I hope we've covered all the ground that the audience would want to hear about. You certainly did take us through a wide variety of topics, and it was really great to hear how your career experience led to those, wonderful philosophies and the wisdom that you imparted about what young people need to think about and what leadership is in the way you practiced it. So, Bob, thank you so much for being with us. I couldn't think of a better way to end our SigTalk season, and with someone like yourself and the kind of words that you imparted. And we're going to say goodnight to our audience, and we hope to see you again soon.
Great. Thanks, Jim. And